Hello. This video is going to provide an overview of complex sentences. So we already learned about compound sentences in week one. Complex sentences are another way for us to combine simple sentences. They help to illustrate the relationship between two ideas, and they also, like compound sentences, help you to create more variety in your writing. So just to review a little bit of the things we talked about last time. First, a simple sentence is made up of a subject and a verb, or a subject and a verb phrase. So, in order for a sentence to be complete, it has to have both of those things. It must have a subject, a verb, and it must be a complete idea. We also learned that the verb and the verb phrase are sometimes called the predicate, that the subject is the thing that performs the action in a sentence, and the verb is the action of the sentence. The verb phrase, or the rest of the verb, including the predicate, explain how, when, and where the action is taking place. We also learned that simple sentences are referred to as independent clauses, and that when we want to write a compound sentence is made up of two or more independent clauses, or simple sentences, if you will, and they're joined in the middle. And they can be joined in the middle by a coordinating conjunction, one of our fanboys words, a conjunctive adverb. Those are those more sophisticated linking words we learned, like however, nevertheless, moreover. Or if they are closely related enough, they can be joined in the middle just by a semicolon. A complex sentence is a little bit different. A complex sentence is made up of an independent clause and a dependent clause, and these clauses are joined by what are called subordinating conjunctions. Now, you want to use a compound sentence when you're trying to balance ideas equally. A compound sentence essentially says, idea number one is just as important as idea number two. But when you're writing a complex sentence, you're emphasizing one part of the sentence over the other. You're saying one idea is more important than the other idea. And the part of the sentence that is emphasized is the independent clause or the simple sentence. So I'm going to give you some more examples to try to illustrate the difference between an independent clause and a dependent clause as we move forward. All right, so first, a dependent clause is not actually a complete sentence. It has a subject and it has a verb, but it doesn't have a complete thought. So an example of a an example of a dependent clause is after we finished our exam. Right? Well, we as a subject, finished is a verb, finished our exam is a predicate phrase, right? So if we just had the sentence, we finished our exam, that would be a complete sentence or an independent clause. But because the word after comes at the beginning of the sentence, this is what we call a subordinating conjunction. It creates an unfinished sentence. The idea is not completed. Well, what happens after we finish the exam? That has not been answered. In the second example down at the bottom, which is being obscured by my face here, reads the sentence, if you want to create narrative tension. Well, again, this is not a complete sentence. It is what we would call a dependent clause. Because the word if is a subordinating conjunction, it creates an incomplete thought. Well, if you want to create a narrative tension, what? What needs to be done? We haven't finished the thought there. If we were to lop off the if and just say, you want to create narrative tension, that would then be a simple sentence. You would be the subject, want would be the verb, and want to create narrative tension would be the predicate or the rest of the verb phrase. On the screen in front of you are some examples of common subordinating conjunctions. These are the words that you can use to create complex sentences. And the neat thing about a complex sentence is that we can put the conjunction in the middle, just like we did with a compound sentence, or it can come at the beginning of the sentence. It depends on how you want to emphasize your ideas or how you want to change up the variety of your sentences. So some examples of subordinating conjunctions are words like after, although, as long as soon as, because, before, even though, if, in order to, once, since, unless, until, whenever, while. So all of these words create conditions, and so we have to answer those conditions in order to complete the sentence. And that's what makes them subordinating conjunctions. So let's take a look at some examples of some correctly written complex sentences. So here we have the original sentence. After we finished our exam, comma, the professor collected the tests. Again, in this example, the first part of the sentence, after we finished our exam, is what we call the dependent clause. The reason why it's the dependent clause is, once again, because it is beginning with the subordinating conjunction. The second part of the sentence, the professor collected the tests, well, that's an independent clause. It could stand on its own. It could be a simple sentence all by itself. If we didn't have the first part of the sentence and we just capitalize the T here, the professor would be the subject, collected would be the verbs, collected the tests would be the predicate. We can also flip it in the inverse and say, the professor collected the tests after we finished our exam. In this case, the subordinating conjunction is still this phrase. This time it comes in the middle of the sentence, after we finished our exam. It's still the dependent clause because it cannot stand by itself, since it begins with one of these subordinating conjunctions. Now, I want to just point out that when you are beginning a sentence with a subordinating conjunction, when the dependent clause is coming in the beginning of the sentence, you must separate the dependent clause and the independent clause with a comma, like you see here. When the dependent clause comes in the second part of the sentence, no comma is needed. And let's take a look at a couple more examples. If you want to create narrative tension in your writing, you must create well-developed characters. Again, the first part of the sentence is the dependent clause. We know it's the dependent clause because it begins with one of our subordinating conjunctions, if. If you want to create narrative tension in your writing, not a complete thought, therefore it's a dependent clause. The second part of the sentence, you must create well-developed characters, is a simple sentence or an independent clause. It can stand on its own. So we couple the two together to create a complex sentence. And the example at the top of the screen is a true complex sentence where the subordinating conjunction and the dependent clause comes first. Again, remember that we're separating the dependent clause from the independent clause with a comma only when the dependent clause comes first. So we can look at the inverse below. You must create well-developed characters if you want to create narrative tension in your writing. Again, in this case, the dependent clause starts in the second half of the sentence because this is where we see our subordinating conjunction. And this time we didn't need a comma. And we didn't need a comma because the dependent clause comes in the second part of the sentence. As long as we continue to use fossil fuels, the environment will be negatively affected. As long as is a subordinating conjunction. Therefore, as long as we continue to use fossil fuels is a dependent clause. Notice it's not a complete sentence. Again, we link it to an independent clause. The environment will be negatively affected. In this case, environment is the subject. Will be is a linking verb, and the linking verb links the subject to a description of it, right? Negatively affected. Here we need the comma because we are beginning with the dependent clause, and then the independent clause comes second. In the second example, the environment will be negatively affected as long as we continue to use fossil fuels. In this case, the dependent clause comes second, and so we do not need a comma. I think we have one more to take a look at. Unless we stand up to those who treat us unfairly, we will continue to suffer. Unless is another subordinating conjunction. Therefore, unless we stand up to those who treat us unfairly is a dependent clause because it is an incomplete thought. We is a subject. Stand up is a verb. Stand up to those who treat us unfairly is a predicate, but it's an incomplete thought because it begins with this conditional word, which we call subordinating conjunction. Notice the comma and then the independent clause. We will continue to suffer. We is our subject. Will continue is our verb phrase. Or actually, will continue to suffer. is a larger verb phrase. So we have our subject, we, and then our predicate. Flip it around. We will continue to suffer unless we stand up to those who treat us unfairly. We begin with the independent clause this time. We will continue to suffer. And then the dependent clause begins with unless. And again, we don't need the comma when the dependent clause appears in the second part of the sentence. This week, when you are creating your discussion board post, I'd like you to try to write at least one complex sentence in the paragraph that you're going to post for English 099. And you can read more about complex sentences in your Rules for Writers textbook. Thanks.